So mental illness, especially in the United States, has been on the rise. Um, can I get your thoughts on that? Your input
Yeah,
on that?
yeah. So when we think about mental illness, you can think of this as having really two origins. And so the much rarer case is when there's something actually biochemically wrong from the genetic level with a person's brain. And so this can cause um, some sort of hallucinations, for example. It could cause some kind of fragmentation in thinking. And this is really a more of a pure biological, neurobiological problem. And this is not the kind of thing that most Americans face when we talk about mental illness. Um, so when we're thinking about that other kind of mental illness, one that is not biologically based or rooted, we're really talking about a spiritual illness. And spiritual illnesses can come from a lot of different places. Um, and to your question, yeah, it is on the rise because something like a third of all Americans are dealing with mental illness problems in some kind of way. Maybe they're drinking alcohol a lot, maybe they are in therapy, maybe they are taking some kind of medication, maybe they are using marijuana or something like that. So, you know, at least a third of Americans are treating it that way, and that's not even then considering those who have some kind of mental um, illness or uh, some sort of problem, but they're not using any kind of method to deal with it. They're just living life through it. So if we are thinking about that, we can probably increase it from a third to, significantly much more, right? If we're thinking about people who fall into a nice, neat, little category of mental illness, like this is specifically bipolar disorder, or this is specifically depression, right? That might be a quarter of Americans, right? But if we're thinking about some general understanding, right? Some general notion of mental illness, like you're just not happy, you are having trouble finding joy in life. Those sorts of problems are not going to fit neatly into of some kind of manual of diagnostic um, psychological problems, right? So when we consider those, or even if we kind of broaden this into some kind of general sense of personality disorder, which is actually in one of those manuals, um, then then we have a much larger portion of the population that could be described as mentally unhealthy, right? So I think that's really important to understand first that there's a difference between something that's biological and something that is more spiritual in nature. Because if you're thinking about something that's more spiritual in nature, we can then think about what the sources of those are, including society, including um, your upbringing, including your family situation, including your financial situation, right? So all of that is generally speaking environmental. So this is all kind of generally understood, I think. I don't think you have to have some kind of unique insight to understand this. But when we're thinking about this sort of thing, we want to again go back to what life ought to actually be. So for um, a human being needs a family, and it needs a stable family. Sorry, a human being needs a stable family. And then you also need proper education in a moral sense. And that comes from various sources. It doesn't always come directly from school, it can always come from the culture. And it also comes from uh, a person's ability to have a stable financial situation, right? To basically believe that they have a safe home that is quiet and free of crime, and also one in which they won't be kicked out of, but also a situation in which they can have food and warmth and so-called material comfort reliably, right? Because once you don't have these things, you have some sort of distress. I've been trying to avoid the term stress because I think this is a very lazy term that is just used to uh, cover any kind of issue, right? There are better words for this, like do you have anxiety? Do you have angst? Do you have malaise? Do you have distress, right? Are you experiencing shock? Are you afraid? Are you fearful, right? So are you afraid of losing your job, for example? Do you are you distressed because there's an emergency situation? Okay. Are you feeling threatened? Are you feeling lost because you're actually making money, but when you come home, you're very lonely? These are all things that you want to think specifically about. You can't just use the word stress all the time. That's not a precise usage of language. And that's going to make you actually suffer more because you can't figure out the root of your problem. Now, the situation today is that the world around you is so dysfunctional, so chaotic, so disordered that you are probably facing all of these emotions all at once, and then you're going to clump that together as some kind of general understanding of stress. And another problem with the word stress is that it implies that it's temporary. But these are such fundamental dysfunctions that it's not temporary. It's going to be lasting, and it's going to take some possibly drastic measures for you to be able to figure out how to fix. So when you're thinking about those things, you have to understand in those terms. So how do you fix this? You want to think about what you need versus what you do not need, right? And that's really key because I think Americans generally just don't understand how to deal with these problems. Okay? Americans simply will look towards other things to solve their problems instead of what they really need to pay attention to. And I think the epitome of this is when people adopt dogs and cats because these are not human beings and they give you what looks like affection, they give you what looks like love, but it's really not the same kind of thing, right? And then, this is a topic in and of itself, and we can look at this another time, but um, the kind of reactions that dogs and cats have regarding a human being is simply a mimicry, oftentimes, of what we think human beings would give us, right? But really, the reason why there's such an obsession over dogs and cats is because they look, out of all pets, most like human beings. They don't even really act like human beings, by the way, right? If you actually wanted a pet that acted more like a human being, you would get some kind of bird because birds actually are capable of having this kind of bonding that dogs and cats actually, if you actually look closely at them, do not actually have, right? So behavior wise, what we have is something that is not as good as birds in terms of having this kind of relationship that human beings think that they have with cats and dogs. Why cats and dogs then? Well, because they have big eyes and they have very expressive faces that mimic human babies. So if you know what a brood parasite is, a brood parasite is something that um, is an organism that isn't actually one's own offspring. It's not even one's own species. So this is something that happens among birds because again, birds are actually a lot more like human beings again, right? So what happens is a bird, oftentimes of another species entirely, will lay its egg in another bird's nest, and then so when the birds hatch, it's clearly not the same species. It's not the same, but because of these bonding hormones that the bird has, it will raise that as its own very own young. Okay, it's considered a parasite because, according to evolution, the evolutionary framework, you're supposed to want to raise your own offspring and put in resources to the survival and flourishing of your own offspring, not that of another, particularly another species. And yet, some of these birds will do that, or many of these birds will do that. And that's the same thing we find with human beings. Instead of actually having your own human babies, you are raising dogs and cats. And so this to me is a very good example of how Americans are actually mentally ill, and they're raising, uh, some other species offspring because they are fundamentally lonely. They fundamentally do have a broken society where they cannot find somebody that they have confidence in having children with, or even if they do find such a person, they're too dysfunctional either financially or even simply morally to want to actually have human children. And so what they do is they have this creature that is, in the form of dogs, constantly flattering them, in the form of cats, very much looking like a baby, um, and making baby noises. And so this is what their attention and time and money and affection is all geared towards. Okay, but if you look at other kinds of issues, just look at how much is being spent, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time, on some kind of intoxication. Okay, just look at the fact that something like almost 20% of Americans are on some kind of psychiatric, some kind of neuroactive medication. Look at how that happens. Because life is actually terrifying. You don't have much, and you could lose what you need to survive very easily, and there's no end in sight. So when we're looking at mental illness, we have to actually see this as a reflection of general societal collapse. And when we're thinking about general societal collapse, we have to understand that the state, the government, is responsible for having a stable society. Okay. And this is not even really considering other kinds of form of self-medication. Like some people will have some kind of really robust exercise regime because when you exercise, you'll release, dopamine and endorphins and so forth, and you'll be temporarily happy. Okay. Now, I'm not saying, of course, to not exercise. You should exercise regularly because it's simply healthy to do, and it will keep your brain stable as well. Um, so you should be working out. All right. But after a certain point, when you're using that exercise as is a way to compensate for the spiritual emptiness in your life, and that's not something that you want to put yourself in a situation where you're having to face that choice. Okay. Another thing that a lot of people do is they just blast music like all the time. When they're in their bedrooms, they blast music. When they're in their car, they blast music. I've been noticing that more and more, and that is also a form um, of self-medication. Okay, because music is a really cheap and easy way, particular pop music and such, to make you feel something, to make you feel excited, and temporarily, as long as that music is on, you feel less empty. You feel like maybe you have some direction in life. You feel like you can take on the world. Okay, but in that sense, that makes it very much like a hard drug. And so you want to recognize these sorts of patterns. And so as you hear more of and more of this kind of thing, or see more and more of this kind of thing, you have to acknowledge this is your society falling apart. This is your government failing you. And so this is all inevitably tied to each other, right? How you feel as an individual, how your family is going, how your neighborhood is going, how your society is going, how your state is going, how you are being governed. So when we think about why Americans are so mentally ill, it is a reflection of the fact that their government is failing them left and right. And that is something of a pun, I suppose you could say, because both parties are not doing what they are supposed to do. Are there any other questions here related to this?
Would you say that the music and the pets are a bit of a coping mechanism, and oh, and the working out as well are a bit of a coping mechanism?
What do you mean by coping mechanism exactly?
Like their way to um like you said, temporarily s- escape the issues, or temporarily escape from their unwanted reality.
They're used as a drug, the same way that alcohol is being used or marijuana is being used. So it's an escape. So we stigmatize things like alcohol and drugs, right? We stigmatize those things. But if you think about it, lots of other things work functionally the same way. That in that it provides you an escape from the emptiness of your life or the suffering of your life or the anxiety of your life or the feeling of doom in your life. Okay. So this broadens actually the indications that Americans are mentally ill because you can watch these shows and you know it's junk, it's no good, it's not that great. Okay. And then I think the superhero stuff is very much a part of this, right? So whether this is a good guy superhero or if you're watching something like The Boys where these are villains, right? It either way, it provides you a escape into a world that has nothing to do realistically with your own. Okay, you're not learning anything profound from these stories. You're not growing as a human being. These are not great um, things of beauty. They're an escape. Okay, they're an escape, and so a lot of this music that's very cheap to produce, that's not very high quality, alcohol or pot usage, or um, or if you're looking at just simply visual audio entertainment of various sorts, right? Your movies, your TV shows. These all function as escapes. So, it's one thing to watch these once in a while because, you're kind of tired, you don't have much energy, you just want to relax and enjoy somebody else's, humor or storytelling. Okay, that's one thing, right? And you're just doing this once in a while. But if the majority of your free time is being spent on these things, then that's when you know you're using this as an escape from reality. And so that's the real issue there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Do you have any recommendations on potential solutions that people can look into?
It's a hard process because what you have to do is you have to actually go and study. You have to actually learn wisdom, right? You have to actually study. And um, one of the things I'm hoping to do here is to help people understand what not only should they study, but just to learn by listening, of course, here. And so when you start learning, what you need to do is you need to figure out what you need. And so what do you need? You actually need to um, you need to get married. Okay. That's really the foundation for everything else, right? Because you need to get married, and then because you are married, you can have children and raise them well. Okay. You also do need a situation, and you can't keep excusing a situation where you don't have this, where you have a place to live that is safe, that is quiet. And you need to make that happen by really any means necessary, right? Whether this means you are calling the police often, whether this means you are moving to a different neighborhood, whether this means you are going to your city council, right? Um, this this needs to be fixed, right? These are things that need to be dealt with, and if you can't, which is understandable, okay, it's absolutely understandable that you can't. Um, you need to be able to find some kind of means of dealing with the situation one way or the other, right? Um, and but at the very least, I think it helps to identify exactly what the problem is. Okay, it helps to identify what exactly that problem is because by pretending it's not a problem, you actually increase the amount of. I'm trying to think of a good way to explain this. There's not a single word for this, but not in English that I know of. But there is a kind of uh, misalignment in your soul. There's a kind of misalignment that happens in your soul, and this misalignment could be small and it could be large. And so when you're dealing with trauma, there will be this misalignment where you know that you've been hurt or you are being hurt in a certain way, but instead of just looking at it and seeing for what it is and calling it evil and calling it wicked and calling the perpetrators villains, instead of doing that, you try to pretend it's not a problem. You try to pretend it's not evil. You try to quote unquote understand the other people. And that's not actually helpful to you. That actually just builds up a lot of rot, a tumor really inside your soul. And that comes out to harm you in various ways. Okay. So even if you can't actually solve the problem, or you don't have the time to do it, or the energy to do that, again, understandable. At the very least, by identifying it for what it is and calling it evil, that is actually much better than pretending it's not a problem. Okay. And that ultimately does save you time and energy and ultimately does help you figure out the solution when you can get around to actually fixing it. Okay. But if you don't identify it for what it is, then it becomes a problem. In other words, if you want to be mentally healthy, you have to actually be a healthy human being, right? So you have to actually identify what you need, the fact that you don't have it, the fact that somebody is causing you to not have it, or you are holding yourself back from having it. Okay. So rather than just keep going back to work every day and then just having barely enough money for the next next month's rent, right? And then um, you have to actually look at the situation very, very, very firmly, very coldly. Sometimes there really isn't a solution financially because that's external, right? That's something that you cannot really fix or help on your own, and that's unfortunate. But sometimes, a lot of people just hold themselves back through this process of pretending it's not a problem, through this process of I'm just going to go and distract myself, okay? Because the distractions will inevitably end or not be enough. Um, so those of you who can, you want to go ahead and direct your life towards the right direction. Okay. So you want to go ahead and invest that time in finding uh, somebody to marry. You want to go ahead and invest your time in becoming more virtuous. You want to invest your time towards getting to a place where you can have a safe home, right? Um, because when you don't have these fundamentals, it doesn't really work anymore. Unfortunately, again, some of us, there's not going to be a solution. You're stuck, and that's a tragedy. A tragedy is when you're fated, and nothing you can really do will fix that. The decisive factors have already been resolved a long time ago, right? Sometimes even before you were born. Um, but there's a big difference, like I said, between the kind of person who pretends it's not a problem, and the person who identifies, yes, this is a problem.